right, good morning. Welcome to be back and glad to see everybody here. So I told you last time we are starting in a very different vein, a different kind of study here than we normally do, and that is that we are not starting at the beginning of a book. But with that said, it is important that we have our context. And I tell you that context means a lot. To understand Scripture, you have to see it in relation to the Scripture that surrounds it, what comes before, what comes after it. And this is a very important lesson. We're looking at the Sermon on the Mount, perhaps the most read, some of the most quoted passages in all of Scripture. But I need you to understand how this stands and why I'm approaching it the way that I am. Each of the Gospels has its own particular take to it. Each one is emphasizing something somewhat different. If you're familiar with the Gospel of John, I'll ask anybody, what is the major theme? What is John out to do in his Gospel that is a little bit unique from everyone else? To know that he is God. It is the book about divinity. It isn't that that doesn't appear in the other three Gospels. It isn't that they don't mention that Jesus is God. It certainly comes up. But John has hand-selected the sections, the stories, the events to prove a point. And so he has looked at the life of Jesus and he's compressed his gospel pretty much down to just the last portion of Christ's earthly ministry, where he focuses on these central issues to prove that Jesus is God. Matthew has a little different take. Matthew focuses on this. This is the story of the king. Matthew is the story about the authority that Jesus, the right to assume the throne of David. If you look at the beginning of Matthew, it begins with the line, the lineage of the king. Proof that the king has the right, Jesus has the right lineage, the right family background to claim that throne. We then have a series of events that you need to understand. The king has arrived. The king has to do certain things. The return of the king, he comes into that station. One, I've established I have the right to the throne by the line, by my parentage. But then there is a challenge. There is a usurper sitting in the throne right now. There is someone else who is running this world, and there has to be a confrontation. So we move from Jesus beginning his ministry, and what is one of the first things he does in chapter 4? No one seems to know. He goes to the temptation. He goes into the desert. He goes into the wilderness to be tempted. There is a challenge set. The usurper is trying to challenge his right to rule. And there's a testing there. There's a thing whether Jesus has the right, has the authority, has the capacity. And there's a showdown between these two people claiming authority in this world. How does that come out?
Jesus wins.
Jesus wins. There you go. Very simple, right? Jesus wins the confrontation. Satan has to leave. He is sent away. And Jesus is ministered to. Coming out of that and now moving into chapter 5, understand what happens next. The king announces himself. This is the first sermon Jesus preaches. It is the longest recorded sermon that Jesus preaches that we're aware of. And he is declaring his status. He is declaring his right to rule. This is the king explaining who he is and explaining the kingdom he's bringing and inviting people to become members, to become citizens of this kingdom. This is an evangelistic sermon. This is Jesus looking out and saying, I am bringing the kingdom. Here's your opportunity. Here's what it takes to enter in. This is what he's offering here. This is what he's placing forward. And Jesus is identifying himself clearly. We talked about that last week, the critics that come up and say, I remember in high school, this always came up. Anybody remember Jesus Christ Superstar, the musical?
Yes.
Big when I was in high school. That was the big thing. And all the people were talking about. Vatican Radio was one of the first places to play it. Everybody's very excited about this until you stop and listen to what's going on in the language and the lyrics of this musical. And one of the things that becomes very apparent is you have a Christ, you have a Jesus who isn't really convinced yet, isn't really sure of who he is and what he's trying to do. There's an uncertainty. Is he the Christ? There's even a song where they're talking to him. They're going back and forth and they're saying, do you, Jesus Christ Superstar, do you think you are who they say you are? And there's this challenge to this whole idea. And a number of people have talked about that. They say that it's the writers that followed him. It's the mantle that was placed on him that he never wanted. Was this guy ever really convinced he was the king arriving to claim this? This sermon settles that issue. Christ identifies himself clearly. He is offering his own kingdom to the listeners. He is establishing his authority, an authority that no prophet, no rabbi, no king of Israel ever claimed to have. And we saw that comparison. We're going to get into that later. Remember how he addressed that to the crowd? You have heard it said. And who was it said by? Other rabbis, other authorities. These are the great authorities of religion in Israel. They have said all of these things. And then what's the contrast? But now I say. And which one does he imply you're supposed to believe? Him. Anything you've heard by anyone else, you need to test it against what I say before you determine if it's true. Now that doesn't sound like a guy struggling with his identity. This doesn't seem to be a guy that's going, I'm not really sure where I'm going with this thing. I'm not sure whether I should try to assume the mantle of the coming king. What is my identity? That's not what happens here. The other thing this sermon does is the king challenges every other authority in this regard. He's looking out at Israel, and he's looking at what has become of their worship, and he's saying this is what you think pleases God. This is what you think puts you in the right place to claim the blessings of God. This is what you are led to believe is the way to get right before God. I'm telling you something different. I'm going to tell you what really matters. And I'm also going to offer this. And I get myself in a little trouble with this each time I go into this passage. But he's going to say this. I'm offering something religion has never offered before. Not the religion the Jews are trying to sell in their legalism. Not the religion of all the other nations on the earth. I'm going to offer you something here that can become a standard staple of your existence that nothing else has ever offered. And he opens with the Beatitudes. Beatitudes, that word is based on blessing. These are the blessings. And I think every one of your translations will say, blessed is. And there'll be 9 of these things lining up, the Beatitudes. And I told you something last week that I believe is absolutely true, and that is this. That word in the Greek that is translated as blessed should be, I believe must be translated as happy. Now, I understand the challenge on that. Everyone that I run into, other theologians will hit this. In fact, I was approached by George this morning. He came up and said, I wanted to point something out to you. And he brought his study Bible over to me. And the study Bible goes through, and at the bottom it has the notes on this section. And it said, here's the Greek word. And it said, the one thing you should never do is translate that Greek word as happy. Okay? I get it. Here's the thing, and I want you to understand this. And I hope I can put this into your minds in a clarity this morning. Why do they object to using the word happy? In fact, I've had people want to change the song Trust and Obey and take out that word happy because they say that theologically incorrect, shouldn't be in that song. Why? What is the objection to using the word happy here? There you go. Happenstance. They say it's based on the word happenstance. A coincidental, unexpected event is tied to events. And therefore, we cannot talk about that because no Christian should live a life where their happiness, where their stability, where their inner security, where their sense of calm is challenged, either challenged by or created by an event. Now, let me put something out to you. Happenstance is not the only root word from which we get the word happy. It does mean a happening, an event. Now, let me ask you this. As believers, as Christians, is there an event we can point to in life? Is there a happening that occurred at some point in life that permanently changed your condition in such a way that there is a character of life, there is a quality of life that you can live in that will not be altered by any subsequent happening or happenstance or events that will ever occur again in life? Do you have something you can point to, a point in time, an event, and say, this transformed what I am into something that will never be challenged again? Does that exist? Oh, my heart. There you go. Another song we can go to. I want you to understand this. The event we point to is a permanent transformation that says you can live a life that is now outside of how everyone else lives and experiences life. There's an event, a happening, that transformed and allowed you to continue to transform your character into a different kind of living. And this is what Jesus is pointing to. I understand the challenge from the critics. If we are going to talk about a life happy, that glazed-eyed, stars in the sky thing where everything's coming up, butterflies, rainbows, and bunnies, yes, that is not something we should expect is going to come as a Christian standard. But if we're going to talk about a calm, a sense of peace, an existence that says, I have a peace of mind, a happiness, an upbeat ability to look at life no matter what occurs, yes, the word applies. Rather than run from it, I want to redefine it and have you understand what Jesus is saying here. I want to transform character, yes.
I think in a lot of circumstances in life, one in particular just in the past, dealing in administration with people coming concerns, and I worked with a lot of believers, and that's the question, what's the worst thing that could happen here? Let's talk about that. Well, this. Even if I lost my job, if I did this, they can't take my salvation. Praise the Lord for that. And I think that's that peace, that happiness. That, when it all comes down to it, I'm going to be, as Paul said, better to die and be with Christ than live. So that makes total sense to me about being happy that my future is secure no matter what happens.
It changes everything. Paul went after that again and again. The worst thing they can do is kill me. If they kill me, I go into the presence of God.
Yes.
Where's the downside is what the challenge is and what he's talking about. Tell me what I have at risk. I can continue to live here and serve God, and that's better for you. Or if I get killed, I'll end here and I'll be with God, which is better for me. Take your pick. I am satisfied. That's what I want you to go after here. This happiness can only be damaged by your lack of committing to the character and the pattern of living that Christ lays out here. Understand, he does not say, I'm giving you a shot at it. This is not a statement of possibility, it is a statement of fact. He is saying that people willing to live by that standard, people willing to accept entrance into this kingdom, will have this if they want it. How do they damage it? We'll get to that later when he brings up a whole section, woe to those. He's saying the only people that can take this happiness away from you is not the happenstance, not the events, not the actions of others. Who's the only person who can lessen the impact of this reality in your character and your existence? You can. If it's going to get messed up, it isn't going to become some coincidental event that happened out here. It's going to become from some stupid decision made here. That's the challenge of the passage. Hope I answered the critic of your study Bible there. This is not to put myself in contrast to other theologians. If you're unsatisfied or don't think I'm working with it, fine. There's room for error here. But I do believe this is the best understanding of the text. And that's why I start there. I want you to understand how different this happiness is, because Jesus is going to describe it in ways that don't make sense. They simply don't. Even if you want to avoid the word happy and go with the word blessed here, if you want to go with the word joy here, try to tell me how joyful those who mourn are. How happy are they? Because those two words, quite frankly, in our understanding, don't belong in the same sentence. Happy or blessed are those who are persecuted, who are insulted, who are reviled. This doesn't add up no matter how we try to translate this word, in our understanding of what it means to be at peace, to be calm, and certainly not to be happy. But Jesus is going to make this a condition of life if we understand it. There's going to be a content here. He starts it out. There's a long sermon. The Beatitudes are just part of it, but this is where he starts. He starts by laying out this aspect of happiness in this evangelistic sermon. Now, last week we read the first 3 verses just to put it together, and here it is. Now, when he saw the crowds, he went up on the mountainside, and he sat down, and his disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are those who are poor in spirit." Now, hold on to this. What drove him, what caused him to stop here, as we said, here's our setting. He's there by the Sea of Galilee. He moves up. The crowds are following. He moves up this sloping hillside. They call it a mountain. We'd call it a hill here, quite frankly, those of us that live on the edge of the Sierra Nevadas and the Rockies. But that was a mountain to them. And he moves up the side of it, finds a space, perhaps an outcrop, some level point at which he can stand, and then he sits down and begins to teach. What motivated him?
They needed him to do it.
They needed the crowds. He looks at the crowds and says, these people need this message now. He needs to make that declaration. Notice the standing. He sits. Remember we told you about that. In Jewish tradition, you stood when it was informal, but when you're going to get serious about what you're going to say, you sat down. You took the seat of authority. You took that place, and now you spoke. Notice, however, his disciples came with him, and he began to teach them, saying, do you notice this? Who were the primary target of his instruction? The disciples. The crowd is getting to listen in on a lesson he is delivering to his disciples. Now, he makes sure they can hear it, because he picks the spot so the crowd can gather around. Why were the disciples the primary focus?
They're going to be the ones that carry stuff on when he's gone.
They have to get this right, because when he's gone, they're going to be the one on the hillside making the comments. They need to get it right. And frankly, at this point in time, the only group of people that had moved to a position to accept his identity, who could get the whole idea, who could really accept what he was going to say right here, was those 12 men. Everyone else is still struggling with this. Everyone else is still under the old understanding of religion. And Jesus now presents something, and notice what he said, "Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." His beginning point is to say, I'm going to offer the kingdom of heaven to the people ready to accept this reality. And he's going to offer this thing. I want you to understand the distinction between what Jesus is going to say here and what every other person who wants to bring and talk about happiness offers. Everyone else that wants to talk about happiness, and I shared some of those book titles with you last week, you can find several 100,000 references if you look up how to be happy. Books, tapes, you name it. All these things are available to you. Jesus is going to offer something very, very different. He's going to offer something that does not seem to make sense here, because he's going to talk, as we said, about a stability, a happiness that does not seem to be affected by the most horrid events imaginable. Mankind always approaches the problem of happiness this way. How do we get happiness? How do people tell? What do you think? If everyone's going to give you advice, what makes you happy? Stuff. Usually it's stuff, or it's events, or it's people. I have had this in counseling a number of times. She's just not making me happy anymore. You're supposed, that's the job. That's your job. You're to make him happy. You're just you have these things. You have these things. It is events. It is circumstances. And they will tell you this. To solve man's problems, to make him happy, to take him out of his depression, to move him past all the bad things that are happening, you change his environment, right? You have to try that. You have to put things together. We are going to solve injustice. We're going to solve racial attitudes. And once we solve all these problems, what will people be? They'll all be happy, because it is only the surrounding circumstances that bring him down, that bring the person down, never allow them to know happiness. Jesus is going to say something completely different. You know what he's going to say? In fact, his disciples say, the world around you know what's going to happen with it? It's never going to be just. It's never going to be right. As a matter of fact, as man gets more and more control over his world, you know what's going to happen? It's going to get worse and worse. The only thing that can change here, the only thing is if you change, not if you change the conditions surrounding you. Do anything you want with that. I love this. They did this thing in Chicago where they decided what they were going to do is that they were having underperforming students, and they said, here's the problem. These students do not have all of the things necessary to make them want to excel and do well. They spent millions of dollars. They redid the classrooms. They made them perfect. Paint every place, brand new computers, brand new everything. They gave every child a laptop to take home, and they set it all up because they said if we change the environment, these kids will do better. And you have any idea what happened? A lot of broken equipment, a lot of damaged paint, a lot of missing computers in a short time. Nothing changed. Nothing changed. Because the difficulty they had with these children was they were not prepared to learn. They had not been brought up in an environment where they were prepared to learn. They had not been, nothing had been there. And changing the environment around them, until you change the character and attitude of the person, they cannot be changed. Just by changing the environment around them. This is what Jesus is going to talk about. He sits, he points this out, and he offers the kingdom. Last time we told you this. A number of critics will say these 3 chapters in Matthew have no basis for the church. Remember that? Simply a useless thing. Jesus comes, he offers the kingdom to the Jews. The Jews say, no thank you. You're not what we had in mind. We were looking for a political leader. This isn't going to work out for us. We appreciate the offer, but we'll wait for the next Messiah. Thank you so much. And therefore, Jesus then said, I withdraw all the promises to Israel. I withdraw my involvement in here. The offer is null and void. I'm moving with a whole different gospel to the Gentiles. That is not the case here. That is not the case. As we said, Paul was very clear. Is God done with Israel? Paul said, no. Are the promises null and void to Israel? Paul said, no. Therefore, understand this. The Old Testament always planned for the gospel to move to the Gentiles. It was there. Guess whose job it was to set the Gentiles up so they'd be prepared for the gospel? It was supposed to be the Jews. To demonstrate the reality of God in such a way that when the Messiah came, not only Israel would be ready for him, but the world. But what had Israel done with its religion? Turned it inward, made it a series of rules and issues that go. And understand why they did that. Let's be very clear about this. Israel changed religion for a very simple reason. I think we can relate to this one. Israel looked at the Old Testament. And guess what you find when you look at the Old Testament and you see what God's standard is for how you're supposed to live? It is perfect. How many of you feel okay with that standard if it's placed in front of you? Your job is to be as good as God. Okay? Who wants that responsibility? Any takers just based on that? You know what the Israel did? They said, you know what? We can come up with something a little better. Now, we talk about this. We talk about the complexity and all the involvement, all the regulations and rules the Jews created, and we wonder and we go, why do they have this super complicated religion? Because a list of rules is a lot easier to follow than a standard that calls for perfection. No matter how complicated the religion was, it was easier than the one they were reading in their text. And here's the beauty of it. By having a list of rules, I know exactly how much better I am at serving God than you are, because I can look and how many more checks I have than you have says I'm the better person. Of the 3,278 laws we've established on this subject, Justin only got 215. Dustin, what's wrong with you?
Just not that good.
I did 2,509. Just to let you know. A comparative. Do you find that that's very natural and human condition to do a comparative? Any of you parents, when the kid gets caught for something, when you're addressing your child, what is one of the first things they come up with when you say, here are the rules and you broke them? And they want an excuse. She did worse, you know. My sister did it a lot worse than I did. Didn't you catch that?
She ate 5 cookies.
She ate 5 cookies. I wasn't alone in the raid in the kitchen when we took all the chocolate chip cookies. As a matter of fact, she got more. And there you are. There's the whole thing. We do a comparative. Why do we want to do a comparative?
We don't feel so bad.
And we can always find somebody worse. And this is the nature of what's going on here in their faith. And Jesus is going to strip all of that away. He's going to bring back in this lesson that statement again, be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Because he wants to take them back and make them understand something. The entirety of the Old Testament existed for one reason, to make you aware that it was an impossible standard. Why did he want them to be aware it was an impossible standard? So that you went to the one person who can do impossible things to solve the problem for you. Who is the only one who's in the business of doing the impossible? God is. It is pointing you to God. And this is where Jesus is going to bring them back. This is another objection people have to this sermon. Some pastors throw this out for this very reason. They say, you look at this and the standard is obviously too hard. Math is hard. I can't pass the course. It's too hard. And they're saying this, you know what we have here? Jesus is talking in this whole sermon about the millennial kingdom at a time way out in the future, and we shouldn't try to take this as evangelistic or a standard for how we live now. This whole thing is talking about that pie in the sky promise way, way out there, and that's what he has in mind. Now, I don't know about you, but if Jesus is going to change the condition of these people, how helpful is it to say, I've got nothing for you today, but someday. Also, I want you to note this. The entire delivery of this is in present tense. He is saying this is the condition when? Now. I'm talking about now. Blessed are, not will be, the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn, not will be. Blessed are the meek, not those who will be. It is always saying this is happening now. He's putting it as a promise he's going to deliver on right now. Also, there's a little problem here. You'll find, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. What does mourning have to do with the millennial kingdom? What does persecution and an insult and being reviled have to do with the millennial kingdom? If it's some future event where all the problems are solved, why is he talking about you coping with problems? It has to be dealing with now. This is the owner's manual for life. Yes, there are some paradoxes. I'm going to tell you this. It's going to take us a while to get through this because I think it may one of the most read but least understood passages you will find in Scripture. These are not cute sayings suitable for framing on your hallway wall. These are conditions of life that he wants to put before us. And he's going to lay it out to how it works. Today's lesson will be just on the first one. I will not ask more of you than a beatitude a week. It's all you're going to be required to focus on. One beatitude a week. Now that's not tough homework, is it? Here we go. The first one, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Why does Jesus begin here? There's our first question. Why is that the first one? Yeah.
That's where the gospel begins. Your humility, your repentance is humility and acknowledgement of your, sins. And that's where he started.
Only humble people get into this kingdom. That's the only ones. If you do not begin with humility, there's no more discussion. We're not moving forward. There's no reason to read the rest of the Beatitudes. It has to begin here. Yeah.
My translation says God blesses those who realize their need for him. And so it's like if we realize we need him, then we're going to obviously listen to the rest of this.
There you
this
go.
is the purpose.
The need. We have covered this before. What was the basis of the very first sin? Pride. What is the one thing that keeps people away from God? What is the base sin that has always been the problem? Pride. So what is the one thing you're going to have to come to terms with if you're going to get into the kingdom? Pride. Something has to change here. I want you to note the progression. This is what's going to happen. Being poor in spirit, that is having the right attitude about sin, leads to mourning. Blessed are those who mourn. What are they mourning over? Sin. They need to be comforted. This leads to meekness. When you recognize your sin and your need for being dealt with, when you need forgiveness, there's an attitude of meekness, a sense of humility, which leads to seeking as we hunger and thirst after righteousness. When you want to do right and you mourn over your sin and you recognize the need, what is going to be your driving force? I want to do better. I want to move this thing forward. So there's a hunger after that. Such people become peacemakers. As we recognize sin, if we recognize our own inabilities, are we more likely to be forgiving? The kind of person who comes to a situation is going to put aside personal issues, going to sit down and work something out because we recognize our own contribution to issues. We become peacemakers. Then it's a purity of heart, as we said, becoming and again calming situations. The result in all that, try this one. Here's the interesting thing Scripture always comes to. Once you become a person who is meek and kind and peacemaker and pure at heart, the world will hate you. Persecution then becomes that. The world will find you irritating. We've talked about this before. What is the one kid every other kid in class hates? The one who does everything right. The teacher says, "Thank you, Matthew, for doing that. That was so nice. We really appreciate it." The one that gets the good grades messes it up for everybody else. That's the guy you don't like.
But I think, too, when there's not another person around to judge your actions, you have a tendency to like being around that person because they treat you well.
It is a dichotomy, and that's an interesting thing. It's so funny to bring up. I love reading studies on different things. Our world today is coming much, much more away from any religious background. Fewer and fewer. The new Generation Xers, the millennials, church attendance, belief in a higher power has gone down. Frankly, I think that's why we have a new religion. It's called conservation or being concerned about the world. I think green is a new religion, quite frankly. Right now, it is not, God doesn't punish you for other sins that we used to talk about, such as homosexuality and lying and pride. No, but he will definitely cause havoc on earth if you put a plastic bottle in a landfill rather than the recycling bin. It's a whole different standard for how God gets upset about things.
The PragerU had a thing just on that.
It is amazing. But there's a result in that. You're right. But they did a study that said this. This world is not liking Christians. We're now haters, revilers. But they were asked, if you had to have a next door neighbor, if you had to have someone you knew that you could trust that wasn't going to harm you, guess which people, almost universally, were chosen? Religious people, primarily Christians. Yeah.
Wasn't that the ancient Roman world was the same way?
The ancient Roman world, yes, with the
You
inns.
wanted to go to a Christian
Exactly.
school, but you weren't going to be killed or...
We might persecute them, we might feed them to lions, but if I'm going to travel and I need someplace to stay that's going to be safe, who do I want to rent a room from, or whose house am I going to stay in? It's the Christian. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really sorry about the arresting squad following after me here, but I had a lovely stay. I felt safe the whole time. You're a marvelous person. Best of luck with the lions. No. It's the strangest thing. On the one hand, they're drawn to it. Like you say, they can't help but say, that is a different attitude about life. That's a different set of values and standards that I can certainly see makes a difference in how this person acts and how safe I feel with them. Yet at the same time, they can't stand them. The same thing that will draw them to the gospel will draw them to persecution. It's the exact same thing in our character. But all this to say, disliked for the world, and finally we can rejoice because we're disliked for the world. Why? Because when we are disliked for the right reasons, what do you know? You're living the life you're supposed to, not becoming obnoxious, not becoming a pain, but because they hate you for his sake, because you have become salt and light in the earth. This is the progression. Jesus starts here then. To get that progression started, you have to have that attitude. You have to recognize you're a failure until God changes you. No confidence in the flesh. No, and isn't that going to be a stretch? If there's anything our culture venerates right now, it is pride in who we are and what we do. The upside down nature of that is astounding to me. Second question, what does poor mean here? Now, something I'll tell you, if you read this section in another book, you will find that the word does not say poor in spirit. It simply says, blessed are the poor. Here's a rule for you in Scripture. Make sure you look at what is said about a topic as many places as you can. Because if you only lift one thing out, you might not get the whole story. Well, it says the blessed are the poor over here, but Matthew gives you a little more information. The reason I point this out is that some people are very much of the mindset that being poor, just being poor, is really the critical issue in being right before God. The Catholic Church makes a big deal out of that. Vows of poverty are a big part of moving into ministry positions. You have to say and set aside all aspects of wealth. That's what makes you holy. Poor here has nothing to do with possessions. It is poor in spirit.
The apostolic Christians are like that too.
They really are. Yeah, that aspect of keeping things away and not having.
You can't have shiny hubcaps.
Yeah, shouldn't have anything. You look at some like the Amish and different things, even buttons, that's considered to be a statement that's just too much. It's crazy.
It's kind of ironic that the Catholic Church, has that push, those who are in, I guess you would say, ministry or whatever, to take vows of poverty, and they encourage that, and that makes you more holy or whatever. And yet at the same time, you go to the Vatican City, and it is
Opulence deluxe.
And the amount of wealth they have, and just historic art alone, there is.
Just in the Pope's wardrobe. I mean, my Lord, it's just amazing that they have, and you're right, this dichotomy. On the one hand, I take a vow of poverty, but the church itself, and here's the distinction. I don't own it, the church does. Well, if you're enjoying it, it's still wealth in your hands. People have had this, and I think even we see it in our class struggle today. We have this sense that somehow it is bad to have things. This attitude that we have toward wealth is an amazing thing. On the one hand, we seem to want it desperately. On the other hand, we resent anyone who has it if we don't. I'll put this out to you, and I don't think you'll hear this in any history class you ever deal with, but this is something. The most, how do I word this? If there's anyone that is enamored with possessions, if there's anyone that is absolutely wealth-centered, it is the communists in this world. These people are the most centered on things of anyone who ever existed. And I want you to understand how I can say that, because they'll say that we're going to take all the wealth away and we're going to distribute it even. You know what it's saying? It's saying that I should have everything you have. It is saying that the ultimate ideal is, whether I've worked for it or not, I don't care if you had the better idea. I don't know if you care if you work nights to build something up. The idea is, I should have possessions. And the whole thing is based on this attitude that I need to take them away from everybody else and give them to me.
They just want control of it all.
We have to control it
I'm
all.
the leader. That's the issue.
I would have the power and control.
Power and control. It's an amazing thing.
And I need an expense account to make sure I can go get all those places. Check my holder.
We see all through this, and people will point to this scripture in Matthew 19:24. You remember the story there? The rich young man comes to Jesus and he says, you need to give away everything you have to the poor and follow me. And the man walks away saying, can't do it because he was very wealthy. There's this thing with the disciples that follows there. The disciples look at him and he tells them this. He goes, it is impossible for a rich man to enter. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go into heaven. And everybody goes, see, right there. Wealth gets in the way of getting into heaven. Now, here's something they miss in the story. Do you remember the disciples' response when Jesus said that?
How is it possible?
Then who can be saved? Now, that sounds odd. If everybody understands that it's wealth getting in the way, what do you think the apostles' response would be? Well, obviously, no one should have anything, right? And that would solve the problem. But they look at him and say, if wealth isn't going to get you in, who can be saved? Now, that's an odd response. What's going on in their minds there?
Wealth is obvious blessing from God.
There it was. In the Jewish culture, it was obvious that people who got more were being blessed by God more. these were better people. They were in better stature with God. So if they can't get saved, when God has seen them because of their goodness and righteousness and given them all this good stuff, then where do the rest of us go? Well, how do we get saved if they didn't have this view that having things was bad? They thought it was good.
It really confused him when the widow's mite, when she put it more than anybody else.
Yeah, what do you mean more than everybody else? None of this made sense in their economy and their understanding of life. And Jesus is pointing out to them, try this. They can't get saved. The ones you consider to be the most righteous, he does the same thing later. He says, your righteousness is going to have to exceed the righteousness of which group did he mention? The scribes and the Pharisees. Now, we always look at the scribes and the Pharisees, and what do we think? Bad, terrible people. Not in that culture. And again, if you had to have somebody move next door, you want a scribe or a Pharisee. These people tended to be the nicest, the most trustworthy. They might be a little obnoxious in terms of their self-pride, but you could trust them. They were going to be honest in their business dealings by and large. They lived a rigid life to a code.
Very giving. You could see when they were giving, obviously.
And they wanted you to see when they were giving. All of these kinds of things. Jesus is challenging to say what you considered holy, the most holy thing you've recognized, isn't enough. I also put this out to you. Is it possible to be enamored with physical things and not have any? Do you think that desire for possession depends on having things? Or can someone be just as greedy, just as enamored, just as materialistic, and have nothing as someone who has everything? It's the attitude. What do you bring to this? Do the things own you or do you own them? You can be just as materialistic and have nothing as someone who is materialistic and has a lot. He's trying to take that of pride. The root word for poverty here is interesting because there's a number of words in Greek that could talk about this. They're just not having enough to get by. This is tokos, and it's the Greek word that talks about extreme poverty, and the root word comes from an interesting thing. It means to cringe or to cower. To cringe or to cower is the verb form of this. Now I want you to think about this. What was the attitude? Now, you see people on the street begging all the time. Do you see different attitudes in beggars out there?
Sure.
What do most people that stop you at the edge of the freeway off-ramp act like? Do they seem to be cringing or cowering away? No. What's different about this word is this. It's an attitude that says, I'm ashamed of my condition, and I'm ashamed that I have to ask for help. They tended to have their head down, and they'd have their hand out, and there was I wish I didn't have to be. It was obvious. I wish I would rather be any place else than here having to ask for this. It was an attitude that is brought to this. It is saying this. It is a person abjectly who recognizes, I can't get by another day unless you give me some help. And it's an approach to God that is completely humbled, humiliated, if you will, looking at themselves and saying, I don't deserve anything, and I'm almost ashamed that I have to ask. Some of you guys, it is harder for some people to be out of work than others because they are used to always making their way, and it shatters them to have to seek help. Applying for unemployment just is one of the worst moments in their life. It is talking about that attitude. All right, those of you watching the recording, I'm sorry we had an interruption in that. I don't know how much you missed, but we'll try to, well, I can't catch you up. I have no idea what to repeat. So we'll just see how it goes. Anyway, two people come into the temple. Pharisee and the tax collector. The two attitudes that were shown. What was the Pharisee's prayer? I'm not like everybody else. Aren't you fortunate that I came in today to talk to you, God? Aren't you excited? It's me. How lucky for you.
The one you blessed.
You know, the one you blessed. And especially he says, I'm glad I'm not like this tax collector over here. Again, by human standards, he was right. Why were tax collectors so reviled? One, they were serving a Roman emperor they were selling out the Jewish people. But worse than this, here was the rule for the tax collector. Your job, John, we're going to make you tax collector. Your job is to get this much money for Rome and send it in every year. Here's the deal. Anything beyond that you gather, No matter how you do it, I don't care. You send this amount, all the rest, you get to keep. That's for you. Now think about that job. What kind of people are likely to take that job as a career option? When you can take anything extra you want, and there will be no accounting for it, there will be no one going after it.
With Roman soldiers to back you up.
With Roman soldiers to back you up. Set the standard any place you want. Rome gets this much, you get whatever you want. They became the most hated people because their quality and character was the worst it could be. But there you have the two different things. What were the two attitudes? The one guy is looking up to God and saying, what a day for you. What was the attitude and the posture of the tax collector? Head bowed, would not even look into heaven, and said, be merciful to me, a sinner. That's our beginning point. That is how it starts. I know Caleb mentioned Gideon this morning. Gideon was chosen to lead because he said two things. Why would you want me to lead? I am the least person in the smallest clan in all of Israel. Anybody you could pick, it's better than me. And God said, you're the guy. That was the attitude he had to have God use him. That's where it started. So we come to this. So we see the questions we go in it. We first, why did he start there? Secondly, what does it mean to be poverty in spirit? The third question, what is the result? What is the result for this poverty? Tells you right there, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They get a future promise. They get to come in. The person who humbles themselves, they get to participate. That's the simple outcome. The fourth, how do you get to be poor in spirit? If that's what you have to be, how do you do it? I'm hoping somebody knows, because these are saved people in the room, and you had to get there at some point in time. What did you have to do to become poor in spirit?
Recognize your need for salvation.
You have to overcome your worst enemy, the hardest person you'll ever have to beat. You know who that is? Yourself. We really like us moving beyond life-centered. It's hard to move a life-centered on ourselves. It's hard to get past a life-centered on ourselves.
Especially when the world tells you you need to do the opposite.
The world always tells you it has to do opposite. Every philosophy, every religion, every psychology thing is all about a completely different attitude. A completely different attitude. Dealing with a young lady in a difficulty right now, I was stunned. She claims to be seeing a church counselor. And the church counselor supposedly told her this, because I approached her. I said, you know what you need to do is you need to forgive. You're going to have to let some of this stuff go, or it's going to eat you up. You've got to forgive this person that you say has caused all this harm to you. And she said, no, my church counselor, I know where you're coming. My church counselor said that that person doesn't deserve to be forgiven. And I'm thinking, what church counselor would
What
ever?
church is that?
Because I want to put that on my list of the do not go list, to put that out there. Poor in spirit. Why do we offer forgiveness? Because we know we are forgiven. An attitude of pride is that. It has to come down again. How will you know when you make it? How will you know when you finally arrive at this point of being poor in spirit? One thing, you'll always find that you're not looking for any situation where the first question is, what's in it for me? That is a change in attitude that is amazing. You look at other people's needs, it becomes an outward focus. Where the first question is not, what do I want to do, but what would Christ have me do? Is a change that comes into this. I will let you know this. People in this attitude have a capacity to cope with setbacks and problems for a very big reason. They don't expect anything because they know they don't deserve anything. And I'll tell you something, when you don't expect, and you don't believe that you deserve, when you receive, do you know how different your thankful attitude gets? When you start to appreciate the things that God has put in your life because you recognize no matter what is there, it's more than you ever deserved. This is our beginning point, to be humble in spirit. I'm sorry for how much those of you who will be watching the video may have missed on this. Hopefully it's enough there. Give me a call, shoot me a text, send me an email. I'll fill in the blanks. The rest of you, thank you for coming, and we'll see you next week for Beatitude number 2.